Again, I'd like to welcome everybody today to the House Committee on Science and Technology. We're going to go get started. Appreciate members that are with us today in person and those that are remote. We've got some members who are have business engagements today, hours from the Capitol, so they're chiming in remotely. We also have a number of members of the public, obviously, who are going to be viewing remotely today. Thankful that many in our committee have been double vaccinated and are able to, consistent with the CDC and our state directions, able to be, for the first time in some time, unmasked here in our legislative proceedings. But I appreciate everybody's attendance today. Before I introduce our speakers for a discussion, let me frame the issue that we've got before us. The issue that we're taking up here in our Science and Technology Committee is not tied to any legislation, but is a chance to begin to delve into a broader question of First Amendment and free speech protections broadly across our culture in a number of settings. In particular, the reason we're looking at this from a science technology perspective as a committee is technology platforms, be they video, be they text, be they other things, are forums for speech. As you think back a couple hundred years, when you think about our nation's founding, Boston town in the 1760s, there's probably 15,000 people. There's a town square they could get together and they could have vigorous discourse. The idea of people being on the stump, you stand on a stump or a box, you're above the crowd, you're able to talk and share ideas. In our modern culture today, the conversation is not just with folks who live in your immediate community. It's a conversation that happens nationally, happens internationally. And the platforms in which that happens are by and large private sector technology platforms. Some of that communications and speech happens through video content. Some of it happens through live discussion like we're having today. People are online watching and can communicate through Zoom or Microsoft Teams or those kinds of platforms. Much of it happens by text, through chat rooms, other circumstances at social media. And there's just the number of platforms is in specific locations is growing. Some of them are very small, some of them are very large with global reach. But the broader question is, how can we maintain a vigorous environment where speech can flourish? We don't proliferate criminal action through speech. As I think most folks listening would recognize, everything that's said isn't legal. If you have a platform that is involved in helping coordinate a conspiracy or criminal action, that communication, that speech is an illegal act. If there's a solicitation for some crime, sex trafficking, or some other, some kind of illegal deal, that communications is not lawful. So what we're not talking about protecting unlawful actions. The question is having an environment and maintaining an environment that's not just sitting together on a cobblestone town square in a small town, talking to the folks immediately around you, but being able to have the kind of statewide, national, and international conversations that are important to have communications and speech flourish in a modern society. Have the private sector be able to provide the platform, the venue for that, but also ensure that the ideas that may be diverse, that may not be shared by all, in fact, some may be hotly disputed by many, can still have a platform to flourish while not straying over into clear illegality. But how do we facilitate that, and what issues are really in play when we seek to address this issue? Which is why, as I talked to a number of our members, both on this committee, outside of this committee, and even members of the public, my commitment as the chair of the House Committee on Science and Technology was to start a conversation and an investigation outside of the context of a bill that changes this code section or proposes this. Let's look at this issue. Let's do it in a dispassionate, thoughtful, and detailed way. Let's understand the nature of the issue before anybody, any member or any member of the Georgia public would say, we need to do this to solve the problem. Because very often we find that the problem we're trying to solve is not the real problem. there's a restated problem that might be addressed in a dramatically different way. So before legislation is considered or even really but becomes even an idea or a direction that might sometimes lead to legislation. Let's talk about this issue of how First Amendment speech can flourish and what some areas are that we can see nationally that there are problems. Let's look at those. Let's talk about those. Let's do this in a bipartisan way. And let's see if there's something that needs to be addressed to ensure speech can flourish in our global 21st century marketplace. So with that, I'm going to recognize some speakers. A number of states have jumped out and done things legislatively. Some of these things I don't think are, as a legislator, don't feel like are appropriate for Georgia. In some cases, I don't think these things even really solve much of a problem, but perhaps there are some lessons that have been learned, perhaps some things that some states are doing that do make sense, that could be part of this issue that the public is raising to us, and how would we proceed with wisdom, thoughtfulness, and in a way that Georgians of all backgrounds, of all interests and perspectives could say, this makes sense, and this really, again, allows speech to flourish in Georgia. So with that, I'd like to recognize our speakers. We've got the leadership from Heartland Institute from Illinois. If you guys could introduce yourselves and give a little bit about your background, I'll recognize you now to make your presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is James Taylor. I am the president of the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy organization. We're based in Chicago. We were founded in 1984. And what our mission is to discover, develop, and promote freedom-centered, freedom-oriented solutions to the problems that face society. And that is why we have a keen interest in the issue of free speech online, because that fits within what many people throughout Georgia and the nation are concerned about for infringements on free speech online.
Okay, you've got a handout with you. Before we get into the details, I'll let you speak to this. This is your handout. It's not the committee's, but you can speak to this, as I'm sure you will in your testimony. You've got a counterpart with you here. If you can introduce yourself as well, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Cameron Schulte. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Heartland Institute. I am a longtime legislative aide in Wisconsin, and then also spent some time at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, running communications for that operation. This was an issue that seemed to beg for attention, and so at the behest of James, I was happy to lead our department. We've been working on this issue all over the country, and we will get into the details of what some of the other states have been looking at. But we have, at the Heartland Institute, been active and monitoring in 33 states on this issue, and just about 70 pieces of legislation. In some cases, they're led by Democrats. In some cases, they're led by Republicans, which I think speaks to a certain universality of concern surrounding this issue. And we'll get into some of the details about that in a little bit.
And again, as I alluded to earlier, our goal in Georgia is to understand the issue and probe into it deeply before we would even suggest a remedy. I know other states perhaps have been looking at this in some detail. Others, sometimes, legislators can take something and put it in the hopper, and maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but we want to make sure we're proceeding thoughtfully. So with that, want to recognize you guys can sort of speak in whatever order you'd like, but if you could walk us through material you have and your perspective, what's happening across the country and states with respect to state public policy action. You've got the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In front of you, you have a handout. This is a bullet point summary of the topic, as well as a couple of articles that I have written on the topic of freedom of speech on the internet. And as you noted earlier in your remarks, when we look at today compared to, say, 1776, Boston was indeed, you had it exactly right. It was a village of 15,000 people. It was the second largest city. It was called a city then. By today's standards, it would be a village. And with 15,000 people, information, ideas, political discourse, this took place in the public town square. And that's the way it was throughout the 13 colonies. That is something that the founding fathers thought extremely important to protect. The First Amendment, protection on free speech, it's more than simply a prohibition against government restricting our unalienable rights. It is an embodiment of our rights that cannot be taken away by any entity, whether that entity be a government entity or a private entity. Without freedom of speech, democracy itself is rather pointless. If we don't have information upon which to vote and make decisions, well, then the point of a democracy is lost. So that is why George Washington, for example, mentioned that to his troops during the American Revolution, that without free speech, we would be led like sheep to slaughter. It is of the most paramount importance that citizens have the ability, Georgians and Americans as a whole, to share political, social, cultural, religious ideas with each other. And that leads us to the problem that we are addressing today. And by the way, Georgia, as Cameron mentioned, and as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, Georgia is not alone considering this problem. 2/3 of the states in our country have advanced legislation during this past session regarding protecting free speech from internet censorship. And that number is likely going to grow in 2022. And it's important, Georgia has an opportunity to shape discourse and any potential legislation in a very positive way. With the large number of states considering legislation, some of which is likely to be enacted and signed into law, it's also important that we have good legislation, that we have legislation that's effective in protecting free speech and yet does not overly trample, does not go beyond the bounds of internet free speech and trample other rights and liberties that we have. So Georgia has an opportunity and indeed an obligation to make sure that free speech legislation, if it is going to be passed, is done properly, is done effectively, and is done in a way that makes sense. So the problem we have, the reason why we have 2/3 of the states advancing legislation, is that now here in the 21st century, the public town square exists on the internet. But what has happened is that there's been a very small number of large multinational corporations that wield monopoly or monopoly-like power on the internet, and especially social media platforms, not just where we receive information from news networks or politicians, but where we exchange ideas and information with each other. And that's of paramount importance and something we need to remember, that the sharing of information with each other as Georgians, as Americans, that is of the highest importance and must be protected. Yet we have a small number of large multinational corporations who have decided to enter the fray, to enter the particular marketplace as it exists of the public town square. They have gained such market share that they exist as a monopoly or monopoly-like entity, as a cartel, and they have the power and increasingly the inclination to block, censor, or restrict particular points of view or speech based upon their viewpoints. That is something we as Americans, no matter where we fall on the political spectrum, should be very concerned about. Although of late, this has been an issue that we've heard a lot of conservative entities expressing their frustration and concern about, it's not a conservative specific issue. The Jacobin, which is a democratic socialism website, newspaper, it's probably the most prominent voice of that political segment, has published, I've seen at least 3, there may be more, articles in the past 6 months saying, hey, while we viscerally like the idea and like seeing conservatives being shut down on social media platforms, we need to be very careful because this can be utilized and employed against us. It has been done in the past, and we from the political left need to stand up in opposition to such censorship. We should be supporting solutions that make sure that everyone has the right to share ideas, to receive ideas on the internet. They pointed out, for example, that in the 2016 Democratic presidential primary, from their perspective, that Bernie Sanders was subjected to a great deal of media censorship and social media censorship that defeated the purposes and goals of progressive policies. The Union of Concerned Scientists has published articles questioning the narrative that we've been fed regarding the coronavirus. And from their perspective, they are very concerned that in an issue that can be so important as, for example, biotechnology and bioweapons, that media outlets, including social media, have censored ideas, discussion, including from scientists, from widely respected scientists. They have expressed concern on this topic. So it's not just conservatives. It's an issue for which there is concern across the political spectrum. As my partner Cameron Schulte mentioned, California is one of the states. Democrats have led the efforts in some states. California has proposed legislation regarding free speech on the internet, and that's a Democrat bill. And it really should be this way, because if we are going to enact legislation in a knee-jerk manner because we are not happy from a particular partisan point of view, we're not likely to get good legislation. We need to make sure that our legislation, if we are going to enact it, is forward-looking, that is not designed to assist or punish a particular party or ideology. But in this case, the potential for nefarious conduct and the real-world examples do exist and are very serious. So in the bullet point summary you have in front of me, that is the problem that requires action. Next up, the next section is the legal landscape. And the reason I've included this section in the handout is oftentimes, and I've seen this in conservative media, progressive media, neutral media, the argument is the states are powerless because Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act protects big tech from any censorship decisions they make. And that therefore, because federal law preempts state law, this is a pointless exercise. But that's simply not the case. First of all, the Communications Decency Act of 1996, as its title suggests, it applies solely to, quote, decency. The language and purpose of the Communications Decency Act was to allow tech platforms to prevent sexually obscene or excessively violent material from appearing on their websites. And those are terms that are explicitly defined in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But the point of the law and the language of the law, again, is to preserve decency. Now, the Tech Cartel, I refer to them as a cartel because it's a small number of large multinational corporations.
And Mr. Taylor, let me say this. I don't want to excite any passions that don't need to be excited. Let's refer to them as tech companies.
Tech companies.
I think
that works.
I'm gonna leave it up to every member to themselves to decide whether they think there's cartel behavior or I would ask you to not refer to them as a cartel.
Good enough.
But I think technology platforms, whatever, might be a more balanced, fair way to address that.
Okay, fantastic. Indeed. So the tech companies their point is that this Section 230 allows us to censor or block anything that we choose. But if you look at the specific language of the act, that's simply not the case. So we've seen that the title of the act is the Communications Decency Act. And the act itself, Section 230 within the act, the part that gives them protection for censoring or blocking material, that section is titled, quote, protection of private blocking and screening of offensive material. Again, this relates solely to offensive material. It's not a title that says protection of private blocking and screening of any material or of material. It says of offensive material. Moreover, Section 230 explicitly states that it's the policy of Congress and the United States in this bill, quote, to encourage the development of technologies which maximize user control over what information is received by individuals, families, and schools who use the internet and other interactive computer services. Again, the point of the legislation, while allowing platforms to keep the internet and the platforms decent, is to nevertheless also recognize that user control is what is paramount and should be emphasized. Users should be able to decide what information they would like to share and receive. Section 230C, which is the subsection that provides the specific protection for blocking and screening of offensive material. It is titled, quote, Good Samaritan Blocking and Screening of Offensive Material. Again, by using the term Good Samaritan, Congress is making it clear that this is a protection against those entities that are performing a public good, that is protecting people from harm. That's what a Good Samaritan does. Now, saying that one particular point of view or one particular ideology or one particular truth as a platform determines it to be is superior to another, that's not Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan language makes it clear again that the act is designed to apply to sexually obscene, or excessively violent material. Indeed, 230C subsection 2A explicitly lists the categories that the section applies to, that the protections for censorship apply to. Section 230C2A states that there must be a good faith determination that material is either, quote, obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable. Now, a couple things stand out here. First of all, by using the term in good faith, again, Congress is making it clear it's not just you can censor or ban or block anything you want. You must make a good faith determination that these particular categories are being violated. And again, each and every explicitly defined category relates to sexual obscenity or excessive violence. Again, the terms are obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable. Under this definition and these terms, for example, folks that support Bernie Sanders would say, hey, it is inappropriate for tech companies to block or censor material that is pro-Bernie Sanders or that criticizes, in the case of the 2016 primary, policies by Hillary Clinton. None of that was obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable. The same arguments would be applied by the Jacobin and also by conservatives. Section 230 is not a federal bill that needs to be repealed or overturned. It simply needs to be properly interpreted and applied. Now, when the tech companies argue for applying 230 beyond sexually obscene or excessively violent material, what they are looking to do is expand the act itself to give them the power to block anything they so choose. For the reasons that I've mentioned, it's clear from the language and intent of Congress, again, that this is a narrowly defined bill that protects the public from sexually obscene or excessively violent material. So in many states that have looked at this issue and that have begun crafting bills, there are some aspects that are better than others. And so in my next section, Ineffective Remedies, I'd like to address two particular proposed remedies that have turned up in other bills and that have been discussed in public discourse. Go ahead.
As you said, Mr. Taylor, if we could, I'm going to stop you right there. I want to see if there's any questions from members of the committee. There may be some. I think, you framed the issue. We talked about the Section 230 of the existing 1996 federal bill. I do want to have you jump in and let's talk about the kind of the contours of that. And you talked about the lewd, indecent, and then excessively violent component. I do think there's a or otherwise objectionable component to that. I want to make sure people can understand and hear. And I'd like to also hear what the arguments are of technology companies that are doing this, that argue they're doing it in good faith. Now, we as policymakers may dispute that or want to understand what that means and may have our opinions about that. But so I'll have a couple of questions that would be clarifying for you in that respect. But are there any questions from members of the committee for Mr. Taylor or others at this point? You got the floor.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Taylor, for being here. Appreciate you. I will probably have more questions as your testimony continues, but Since you are the featured guest in today's committee hearing, I would like to know a little bit more about your organization. So you mentioned that you are a nonprofit organization, but your Wikipedia page says that you are an American conservative and libertarian public policy think tank founded in 1984. So can you explain that a little bit about your entity?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and Mr. Chairman as well. We are a public policy organization. We're nonpartisan. And as I mentioned at the outset, our mission is to discover, develop, and promote freedom-centered solutions to the challenges that confront society. I don't personally define us as conservative or libertarian, but our beliefs in a freedom-centered society often lead people to describe us as such. I won't run away from those labels, but basically what we believe in is freedom-centered solutions to problems.
Well, I find that curious because there is an entire page on the Heartland website talking about libertarianism.
Sure. We certainly discuss libertarianism, we discuss conservatism, we discuss progressivism. Many of the folks who support us are libertarians because we believe in freedom throughout society, and we welcome those people. As I said, we don't run away from those labels. I don't explicitly apply them to our organization because I believe the term freedom and free markets, especially in economic issues, those are the values that we champion.
Gotcha. So are you a lobbying organization or are you not a lobbying organization?
No, lobbying would imply that we are taking positions on specific legislation, and usually that's within a certain industry or certain companies. What we do is we advocate for the principles of freedom.
Well, Mr. Taylor, is it not true that either you yourself or members of your organization have in fact lobbied in other states for particular legislation that deal with this exact issue we're talking about today?
So according to federal law, an organization that's a public policy organization, a 501c3, may engage in a small amount of what would be technically described as lobbying, which would be weighing in on particular legislation. But the primary purpose of the Heartland Institute is to be a provider of ideas rather than to be focusing our efforts on particular pieces of legislation. We may do so incidentally now and then, but again, within our federal guidelines, we exist primarily to promote ideas and principles.
And have you ever reported expenditures from your organization that fall under the category of lobbying?
So as far as what we report, I would have to look at our reports if there are specific reports or not reports. There have been de minimis expenditures that would be, that can be argued to relate to particular bills. But again, our entire or near entire focus is on ideas. And when legislation comes up that addresses those ideas, incidentally to those ideas, well, then of course, we would like to comment on that.
Thank you. Do you mind if I continue with a few more?
You still have the floor.
Okay.
Representative Moore. Yeah.
So, we've talked a lot about free speech, First Amendment rights, all of that. To quote the First Amendment, or at least the part that's relevant here, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So when we talk about the tech companies that you describe as the cartel, are they the government or are they private businesses?
So the companies, and I describe them in some of my writings as a cartel, but for this hearing, of course, it's also appropriate to describe them as tech companies. But I believe that there are a small number of large market share companies that have acted in concert. I think the evidence is pretty clear on that, to restrict freedom of speech for Georgians and for Americans as a whole. These are private companies that nevertheless have the large market share. They have acted in concert with government, which is also very troubling. But even if they had not acted in concert with government, still, whether people's freedom of speech is infringed by government or by a private entity, our free speech rights are unalienable, and government should certainly protect them.
Well, the definition of libertarianism that you promote on your website says that libertarians oppose government interference in people's private lives and in their businesses. And we are here to talk about as you described, free speech with relation to private businesses. Is that right? So how do you square that circle?
Well, first of all, let me commend you for your concern for libertarian principles. So I thank you for that. I agree with you on that. As far as freedom, as proposed, the freedom of companies to behave as they please, that's a principle that we generally default to, the right of companies to act as long as they're acting lawfully in accordance with their intent. However, let me also state that, for example, let's say that here in Georgia, for example, and in the state where I've spent most of my life, Florida, there are private entities that operate state prisons. So if government allows private companies to run state prisons, if those companies choose to engage in that realm of business, especially if they were to gain dominant market share, but whether they do or don't, the fact that these companies now run prisons doesn't give them the right to infringe upon the prisoners' unalienable rights themselves. And whether that's a government entity or a private entity, even as somebody who believes very strongly in freedom and free markets and sympathizes with many libertarian principles, I would not say that those companies can nevertheless trample upon inmates' unalienable rights because they are private companies. When you choose to engage in a sector or in a business that is in itself of greatest concern to our individual rights and to government and public entities, sometimes the nature of that business means you must accept some restrictions and some guidance in how you will behave. And I think that's the case here when tech companies choose to become involved in the 21st century version of the public square and decide who or what points of view may be shared. And I think that's very troubling.
So to Representative Moore's question, I'm sorry.
I have a follow-up, but
I will. I think I just threw one. To her question, it's your contention from earlier that the technology companies, although they contend they're following the law, you contend that they're operating outside of it. I think that's your belief. And that may be a question that every member decides as we sort through this. I would say, and I appreciate Representative Moore's questions. I mean, I think the organization you come from, I think you're coming as a representative. You're not coming as a private citizen. I do think you need to be very clear as who your organization is, what they represent. I appreciate the question. And I'm not going to suggest we not delve there. So I appreciate the lady's question. I do want to make sure we are staying germane to the topic. I do think it's germane to explore who the organization is that you represent. So the lady still has the floor, but let's do try to direct this back more towards the question where we can. But appreciate the lady's questions.
I find the entire conversation germane. So I'll continue if you don't mind. Thank you. Well, your analogy to private prisons, I think, is an interesting one because, that's a situation that I would describe as a necessary government function that has been outsourced to a private organization, but they are performing an important government function. Where's the analogy with Facebook and Instagram? How are they performing a government function that's been outsourced to those organizations?
Well, I think very importantly, Representative Morrison, thank you for the question. I think very importantly, what these companies are doing is that they're infringing upon free speech rights, whether they are performing a government function or not. The fact is free speech rights are recognized from our founding fathers, and they're recognized not just because the founding fathers recognize them, but because they are unalienable to the human condition. So the argument that a private actor should be free to infringe upon and stifle somebody else's free speech rights merely because they're a private actor, I take great issue with that. And I don't believe that contradicts a respect for and an admiration for a freedom-centered society, including free markets. In this case, there is no greater right than the right to free speech. There is no important topic than the ability of individual citizens to engage in free public, political, cultural, societal, religious discourse. I think that trumps all.
So I'm going to recognize Lee for one. Do you have a follow-up question, or is it?
I got lots of follow-up questions, but I appreciate the time you've granted.
Go ahead.
Can you give us some examples of speech that you feel that private companies have infringed upon as it relates to individuals' free speech rights on a private platform?
Well, I can tell you that I have many Facebook friends and many dozens of my Facebook friends have reported having information that has been blocked or censored based upon nothing that is sexually obscene or excessively violent. I can also tell you that a good friend of mine, John Stossel, had a program in which he hosted a discussion of scientists, including scientists with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that has been banned from being shared on YouTube because they deemed it to be not fitting with what they believe to be the science to be. Across the board, whether it's political speech, cultural commentary, religious thought, or debating the public policy topics of the day, America is a country that's founded upon people being able to share ideas. The internet is indeed the 21st century version of the public square. This is how a majority of people receive and share information. And if government allows, whether it's government or itself or a private entity, to severely restrict that, this is something that is a grave threat to all of our freedoms.
Thank you. Representative Moore, thank you for questions.
you.
Chair recognizes mic number 5. Is that Representative McLeod?
Yes.
Representative McLeod for a question.
Oh, no, I'm 5.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm 4, I think.
Chair recognizes Representative McLeod.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Taylor. You said that there's been some laws already being drafted in about 33 states,
Correct.
and you said about 77 pieces of legislation.
Correct.
How many pieces of those legislation have you been actively involved in?
If I may, thank you for the question, Representative McLeod. If I'll defer to Cameron Schulte, my colleague, who's more knowledgeable on that than me, if I may.
Please do.
Mr. Chair, Representative, thank you for the question. Of those, give or take 70 pieces of legislation, we have testified on give or take about 22, give or take about 20 pieces of legislation that we've testified on, speaking to the issue of what's good in that bill, what's bad in that bill, and kind of laying forth, as James did earlier, the political landscape of the need to discuss the issue and for states to in their ability to address the issue.
It's 22 pieces in the guidelines of a 501c3.
I will defer to James on his earlier remarks on that, but in that case, we are very mindful to not explicitly support a particular bill, the language we use, and we are very conscientious about setting forth when we do testify in a state that we are providing for information purposes only.
Let me ask you about January 6, 2021, where there was an insurrection and a sedition that happened on our U.S. Capitol.
Hey, Representative McLeod,
Mhm.
we're not, this isn't a
We're not there
platform. I'm sorry, this isn't a platform to, and again, I want to give the ladies broad range to ask questions germane to this. This is not a platform to, I would just call, as you ask the question, I want to make sure it's germane to this issue of speech and not, so just.
Yes, because
be mindful
it's
of-
about violence, right? On in section, what, 230 was it? There's particular about offensive material and lewd and violence. So this, a lot of this organizing happened on Facebook, and the president at the time encouraged it. So do you not think that the platform that Facebook has as an independent business owner has a responsibility to make sure that their other users are not in danger? So are you saying that Facebook should not shut down someone who incites violence?
Thank you for the question, Representative and Mr. Chair. My perspective is this. Section 230 of the Federal Communications Decency Act is legislation that is well thought out, that is appropriate, that does not need to be overturned. And Section 230 explicitly gives protection for internet platforms and social media platforms that censor excessively violent material. Now, if they determine in good faith that a particular incident, whether it's January 6th or anything else, is excessively violent material, then they will be shielded from the law.
That's correct.
Yes.
And I think as I tried to frame, I appreciate Representative McLeod's question. Thanks for it being focused. I think the issue, I'm speaking as the chair, I think we can all agree that if there is a organization or a platform being used to organize a violent act against any government building, that's a crime, and it's a felony. And any platform that sees that a felony act against a government employee, a government building is being organized, that by definition is criminal. And that's the exact kind of thing that platforms ought to shut down because it's a criminal act. That's why I drew the question. I think the question I'm seeking to investigate, and I appreciate the gentleman coming today on their own dime, by the way, is to look at where is the line drawn. As I teed this committee meeting up, I think we should all agree that if there's an organization of an illegal act, then, and you have a platform that you see a criminal conspiracy being organized under, I think we can all, or should all agree. I would certainly hope we would all agree. There's a very bright line there that says you organize a criminal act, you get shut down by a platform. Okay. As members of our committee, I think we can all agree with that. I certainly believe that, and I think anyone would. I think the question is when we're talking about issues that are not criminal, there's not a criminal act that's being even allegedly being organized, but it's a perspective. When does a perspective, and this is how I view it, when does a perspective that is right or wrong, but a perspective, a legal perspective to have, when is that the content-based censorship or deplatforming of that, which is a clearly legal act or perspective, right or wrong, when is that a issue of a First Amendment infringement versus a crime? So, and I appreciate the willingness of the gentleman to come today. We, by the way, for committee members, we ask a number of the platforms to come and be heard. I think they raised their hands. We will come at a successive time. We wanted to have a really vigorous discussion from across the spectrum today. And I would like to thank the gentleman coming from Heartland Institute. They're the ones that raised their hand and say, we know this issue and we're going to come and like to speak to this as a public policy entity. Not lobbying on a bill, but just from an informational perspective. There's not a lot of folks that are operating out there that can sort of speak to these issues. I'd like to thank them for being here today. But these are your committee members. These are folks, as Cameron alluded to, they've been involved in public policy debates across the country. Fire shots at them, ask questions of them, ask to understand this issue better. They're here to provide us an understanding of where these lines are. And I think there's not a lot of attorneys that have expertise in this. There's not a lot of public policy entities that are engaged in this space. So they're here to be your punching bags today. Ask these questions to them. I do think it was germane that Representative Moore asked the question about their entity. They do hold themselves out, I believe, to be a libertarian conservative entity. I think it's a fair distinction to make. I don't want to spend all our time attacking an entity. There's entities that come to us all the time that have a very clear perspective. But I do appreciate their being here to take the questions and ask them hard ones. So Representative McLeod, any further questions?
I'll have more.
Okay. Chair recognizes Representative Roberts for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, I'm sorry. So are you arguing that people have a constitutional right to use Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms? And couldn't a private person just opt to use online platforms more acceptable to their idea of what the terms and conditions of a platform?
Well, thank you for your question, Representative. My point is that people have an unalienable right to engage in public discourse, especially political discourse, to share their thoughts on political, cultural, or religious topics. And as mentioned earlier, back in 1776, people could gather in the town square. Boston was the second largest city in the country. It had 15,000 people. The town square was the place where ideas were shared. And if the Crown had given the East India Tea Company the right to take over and administer the town square, and the East India Tea Company said, we can no longer have discussion of topics of freedom, of liberty, etc., the people would have revolted. Our founding fathers would have objected, and rightly so. In today's world, the internet is where people, and especially although I'm concerned about elected public officials and other people in authority being able to communicate with their constituents, I'm much more concerned about individual Americans and Georgians being able to communicate with each other. And there is no public square in Atlanta where you have vigorous town debate and where people share information and can receive information. What you have is the internet. That is where a majority of people receive and give and share information on all these topics. And so if a private entity is going to make a decision to venture into that space where our unalienable free speech rights are exercised, that is the primary place where they're exercised, well, then that entity should be held to a standard of respecting free speech rights. And so the fact that they're a private entity doesn't lessen the freedom depriving impacts of censorship.
Well, I find that interesting because there are still lots of public spaces that people could talk. We're a free market society. And so these private companies have entered into a marketplace. And so there are other platforms that people could sign on to. So where does this government censoring of private companies end? Would platforms like Yelp and TripAdvisor be liable for hiding comments they believe to be fake reviews under your ideas of what these legislative proposals should be?
Before you answer that question, and to Representative Roberts, there is no legislative proposal.
Other states, I understand right now there isn't.
And that's another reason I appreciate Larry's question, and I'll let you follow up here in a moment. That's why I was very clear to frame this as I've not been impressed with what other states have done. I mean, I don't want to cast shadows in anybody. I'm not going to say I like this state. I don't want to go there. I just, across the board, have not been pleased at all with what I've seen.
Okay.
And I've not seen any state that's doing something that I think Georgia ought to go do. I do think there's an issue. I mean, I do think we've got this, we have to weigh this. We have to weigh out this property interest of private companies, which is a very real one. I appreciate the lady bringing that out.
Well,
versus
and
the
everybody
speech interest.
signs on to their terms and knows exactly what their terms are when they sign on to use Facebook. I'm looking at their what they allow on there. And so you accept that when you sign on to their platform. And I don't see how that's different than other private companies making choices about how they want to run their business.
Well, thank you for your question, Representative Roberts. There are a few points there. I hope I remember each of them.
Okay.
The last one first, in terms of service. I don't think that anybody in this room would like a country where you can be forced or induced to sign away your unalienable rights. I think that was something, my goodness, throughout the country's history, we've had a great deal of progress where we have had our unalienable rights trampled on, but then redeemed. For example, we can go back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's an argument that was made back then. Well, this is something that private enterprise should be able to do on their own terms and conditions. And if they have a policy, if they have policies that are discriminatory, and you accept that when you walk in, I don't think many people think that was something that we should tolerate in a civilized society. In terms of where this might end or where this might apply, in my paper, my bullet points there, I point out that effective legislation would be narrowly tailored to platforms, social media sites, who, first of all, whose purpose of existence, whose primary function is to allow users to post their opinions. So Facebook, Twitter, this is a user focused, these are user-focused platforms. It does not apply to, for example, if you are Jacobin, as I mentioned earlier, they can still have their website and they can publish their democratic socialism points of view, as they should be able to do. Regarding Yelp, again, this topic is one in which if we have legislation that complies with the principles that I think are sound, that I've laid out, that even more so protects people from being able to give reviews on Yelp or anywhere else. Again, what we are doing is we are saying it really wouldn't apply because again, it's regarding large market entities that are focused on user-oriented platforms, but to the extent it does, it protects people's right to express their point of views. It doesn't restrict, it protects.
But what is the protection for that company for people who go on and make false reviews and then damage that company's reputation? And they prove those every single day. So that's one issue. But also, you're talking about a private company that it's taking away your inalienable right. No, you can choose, and I have lots of people who have chosen that didn't like Facebook's policies to get off of Facebook. Everyone has that right. We've gone from MySpace to, I don't even know all the different variations. There's a new one every day, TikTok. And so there are other platforms out there that if it doesn't meet your private interests or what you want to say, or you can't comply with their platform, then why not just go find another platform?
Let me try to draw this point because I want to manage our time well. What I hear Representative Roberts saying, I want to try to connect what she said with your point so we can get that direct connection here. You addressed the issue of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and before that, people who ran lunch counters in certain states said we have the right to decide who gets to sit at our lunch counter. If they don't want to play by our rules, then they can't sit at our lunch counter. They asserted a property interest. And the Civil Rights Act said, yeah, there's a property interest there. But there's also this liberty interest of the individual that you shouldn't be kept away from a lunch counter because you're in a wheelchair or because of the color of your skin. And with all that, there's this clashing, and we had to reconcile this issue of property interest and the liberty interest. And I think the question is, to Representative Roberts' question is, how do we weigh out this property interest of somebody that has a platform that they're managing versus the liberty interest of should you be able to say what you want to say? And let me just, because I've got other folks waiting to speak here. From my perspective, Representative Roberts, because this whole, Heartland Institute's here to give their perspective today. They're not the sum total of this discussion. This discussion is really about these committee members. From my vantage point, how do we weigh out those interests? Should you be in a place, let me take a hypothetical. If, for example, and by the way, I'm not suggesting there's an internet platform that does this or an email platform, but if, for example, hypothetically, you had to engage in email, you had to allow any email you sent out to be publicly seen by anybody. There's no private email. Should you have to submit to that to have emails? Or I would argue that somebody ought to have a right to have an email they pay a service for every month or whatever, $10 a month, so I can have private email. Has email emerged in our culture to a place where people ought to have access to email? Using the word right is a big word. Right is a really, really big word. I'm not saying there's a right to email, but as email and text communications becomes a thing in America, should someone have to submit to a platform selling the content of their emails or text to anybody that might want that? I ask that as a hypothetical because you do have this property interest. The platform ought to be able to sell, if it's the terms and conditions that you raise, they ought to be able to do whatever they want to do. I think we can all nod our heads at that. I think we can also nod our heads at this issue of you ought to be able to have communications that are with an expectation of privacy, or you ought to be able to, if the way that people in our 21st century culture communicate with each other is not the town square, but it's some other platform, there is a liberty interest that's there. How do we weigh these things? That's what I want this committee to wrestle with. This is not about Mr. Taylor. It's not about me or you. It's for the committee to discuss what is that balance and how do we strike that? How do we land in the right place? That's what we're trying to get at. I appreciate the lady going at it. That's a question we've got to wrestle with as a state that I don't know that other states have solved yet. So with that, we do have some time constraints, and we'll go ahead and recognize mic number 1. Is that Representative Davis? Representative Davis.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming and discussing this. Very important topic. As an Army brat and a veteran, I commend people who stand up for our constitutional rights, such as the freedom of speech, because my father, who retired from the military, who raised me, retired from the military as a first sergeant, a drill sergeant. I always said, if you look at the Officer and the Gentleman, for those of us old enough to remember that movie, you take that drill sergeant, multiply him times 10, and that's my dad. He raised us to take pride in the work we do in serving our country. So much so that I served. I have another sister that served and two brothers. So we're a family of veterans. And of all of us, I have another brother that's a disabled vet, as well as my father, who's a Vietnam disabled vet. So I don't take it lightly when it comes to liberty and freedom of speech. But in that same token, I have a mother who raised us with a very violent memory of being a child in Alabama, living with my great-grandparents and having the Ku Klux Klan come to hang my granddaddy. The memory she has is, of course, of the burning flames, and more than anything, that Confederate flag. Now, a lot of people would say, and not only that Confederate flag, the noose, because they were ready to hang them. A lot of people would say that flag is a person's history. It's their First Amendment right. But for my mother, it's a memory of a violent attack that she survived, and really my great-grandfather survived. I'm with my chairman in that when you serve your country, when do it cross the line of liberty? When do your liberty oversteps mine? Now, we have a family of veterans who served, and we didn't take no deferments. I ask you, on January the 6th, as we can pick out a number of different dates, you tell me, when do you think the freedom of speech really crosses that line? I know you said violence, but like I said, I would defend a person's right to hang that Confederate flag, right? But then in the same token, I know my mother is suffering from that very violent memory. When do we cross that line? And then how do we hold people accountable that cross that line?
Well, thank you for your question, Representative Davis. And clearly, you're speaking from the heart. And clearly, these are issues that everybody should consider. For me, what's very powerful when I hear your story, and when I think of the American experience in all its aspects, is that freedom of speech, freedom of sharing ideas, freedom of discourse is what champions all of our other rights. And I believe legislation that would protect free speech rights online, where they're being most abused and where they're most important, I trust people like you telling your story, many others telling our stories, more than I trust a few multinational corporations who tell us what can or cannot be discussed. And you bring up a very good point when you say, where does my freedom crossed a line of encroaching on your freedom, or where it is what you're looking to do and infringe upon my rights. And that's one I think that's very germane to this discussion, because what we're looking at here is we have these large multinational corporations that have captured dominant market share. And sometimes they say, well, we have First Amendment free speech rights also. And therefore our free speech right entails us being able to shut down your free speech in a public square. But that's not true. That is where the line is crossed. If I don't like what my neighbor is saying on his telephone wires, I don't have a right to go cut his telephone wires. If two of my neighbors are talking and I don't like what they're talking about, I don't have a right to put a gag on their mouse. They have a right to speech and I have a right to speech, and nobody has a right to cut off anybody else's speech. And I think it's important that stories like yours get told. If this were 50, 60, 70 years ago, you might have these actors preventing you from telling your story. And unfortunately, the whims of politics shift, they change. And if you allow, whether it's a few corporations or any entity, the right to restrict our free speech, then we are setting ourselves up for, again, a recurrence of oppression. And I don't want to see that happen. I know you don't want to see it happen. And I think, therefore, again, it is our freedom of speech that trumps somebody else's asserted right to shut down our speech.
May I have a follow-up? I worry about the power of government like you do. But I look here in Georgia and the legislation that we can pass and the damage it can do. Like, we both fight for freedom of speech. But I know there's a backdoor way you can do legislation where I can shut you down from speaking, such as, and you look at the different legislation, opening the door to where I can sue you for those different types of speech can not only shut you down, but shut down our courts, the whole works. How do we stop from maintaining our liberty, but not shutting down the courts, shutting down freedom of speech? Because sometimes you can have a double-edged sword. Like they said, if you poke out eye for an eye, if I poke out your eyes and you poke out mine, we end up both blind and nobody see nothing. How do we stop from going that extreme? Because I think that's what we're worried about.
Yeah. Thank you for your question again, Representative Davis. A very good point. And for example, an earlier question asked, well, then what about if somebody posts a false review on Yelp or some other entity? Well, I would rather have a court of law determine, because there's nothing in legislation that we would support or that we've seen or that we would say should be considered that eliminates defamation from a civil cause of action. It just, I would rather have this determined by a jury in a court of law rather than Facebook or Twitter or some other private tech company as to what constitutes defamation. Now, if the concern is, and it's one that is well-founded, are we now opening the floodgates for litigation, for bottling things up? And I think that's, again, it's good to have that concern. Let me posit this. If there weren't laws against shoplifting, burglary, whatever it is, you'd probably see more of it. The laws that proscribe it lessen the occurrence of it. Now, granted, if there were no laws, there would be no criminal cases for shoplifting or anything else. But overall, I think we would say that it is good that we have such laws that protect our rights against other people infringing upon them. And if there have to be some judicial actions to enforce them, so be it. But that is a greater benefit than the benefit of not having cases, but allowing people to infringe upon other people's rights.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Davis. Chair recognizes Representative Jones for a question. Did you push? Okay. Who's 8?
Oh, all right.
Representative Wilkerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess just real brief, these are follow-up questions to the questions we had earlier. I guess back to the constitutional rights, you had mentioned if your neighbor was talking and you wouldn't be able to cut them off. However, if they were in your house, you would be able to take them off, kick them off your phone. So I guess we're talking about private rights versus your rights versus mine. Are you saying, I guess, direct to the point, are you saying you have a constitutional right to use Facebook and Twitter? Is that what you're saying here?
Thank you for the question, Representative. And by the way, if I'm looking forward and not looking at you,
Yeah,
I'm
you're
not
fine.
trying to disrespect
fine.
you. I'm just trying to deal with the microphone and all that. We have unalienable rights to share our ideas, our political, cultural, religious ideas. And in the 21st century, the public square is the internet. When a particular company or group of companies make a deliberate decision to enter that square and achieve dominant market share, because again, in my materials, I specify that this would apply only to dominant market share companies. And then they restrict Georgians' rights to exercise their free speech. That free speech is severely, severely infringed upon. Whether we like it or not, and whether theoretically some other alternatives may exist or may in the future come to exist, probably on the margins, that may give people other opportunities. The fact is, Facebook is where people share ideas. Facebook is where people talk with their neighbors. Facebook is the one place where I know I can find somebody that I meet in an airport and we have a nice conversation, and we can strike up that conversation. If a private entity, just as if the East India Tea Company were given a right by the Crown to administer the public town square in 1776, people would be outraged if they did so in a manner that restricted free speech rights. The same applies here. Our free speech rights are unalienable. And if you take them off the internet, if you take them off the platforms that dominate the internet, I ask you to really think about that. I mean, I understand that we have concerns. I understand we don't want this to get political, but do we really want to make it more difficult, extremely difficult, for people to share their views, their political, cultural, religious views? Do we want it to be more difficult or less difficult? And if a company deliberately enters into the public town square, especially when they're doing it to turn a profit, I think our free speech rights that are unalienable, that cannot be taken away by government or by private entities, should prevail. But I do appreciate the question, because it's something I wrestle with too.
And I'm sorry, just follow up, and then I have one other question, and this should be brief. I guess in like 5 words or less, just to help me out here, are you saying that you have a constitutional right to use Facebook, et cetera? Because the government has not outsourced free speech to them. I'm just trying to get a clear understanding. You're saying you have a constitutional right to use Facebook.
Well, thank you for the question again, Representative. I say that we have a constitutional right to freely share our ideas with our fellow citizens. And if anybody infringes upon that, whether it's Facebook or not, then that is something that is very detrimental to our rights and freedoms.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess
I've
more
got
question?
somebody else. One more. Got
last
someone
question. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to get a clear understanding. That's why I was trying to be brief. Back to the lobbying point. I just want to bring this up, and you may not know this, but on your 990, you spent $1.6 million in lobbying efforts per your 990 for the last 4 years, about 400,000+. So as we move forward, if we do talk about legislation, I just want to make sure that we are complying with the terms of what Georgia law is, not necessarily, not only federal, but Georgia law, once we move forward to the influencing of public policy.
Yeah,
But
I will tell you, and I want to say this to all of our members or anyone that's watching. I want people to come to me that want to speak to this issue. And this is anybody that has expertise in this and wants to speak to this. We have, my assistant has spent better part of 2 months trying to find folks to come speak to this issue. This is an entity that came on their own dime to speak to this. I want to hear people speak at this, because I'm a little, honestly, as a legislator, I'm disheartened that there's not broader interest of entities that work in this space, that want to speak to this, and want to come here and talk to us. So I would deputize you, Representative Wilkerson, to help us bring people that can speak to this.
And I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to add this though. I think I agree with you. You want that public discourse, but we also want the transparency and the compliance with our laws. And that it's very important before we even have that discussion that people comply with our lobbying laws so that people know how we are being influenced.
Yep.
So if people don't disclose that they're spending money to influence legislation, then they can't be involved in the process. But I do appreciate you reaching out to folks, and I would love to see anybody that comes up here that spends more than our threshold comply with the lobbying law so that the public knows what we're doing here. But thank you.
That's certainly my expectation. Yeah, do you want to address that briefly? Since
If I may, Mr.
yours?
Chairman,
Yes.
thank you. And thank you, Representative. Without having our 990s in front of me, I can assure you that we do fully comply with any applicable laws in that regard. And the fact that I'm not saying that I'm validating the numbers that you claim, but for whatever numbers you were able to pull up, whether they're interpreted properly or not, I can't say without in front of me, but I will say that, as you say, you found them in our 990s. We don't hide anything. And our purpose, again, is to advocate for free market ideas. I think we're doing that today.
Chair recognizes online Representative Dreyer for a question.
Thank you very much. Jermaine, if that's okay.
Representative Dreyer, we can't hear you. You're buffering pretty bad. I don't know if turning off your video might help. Sometimes we constrain the
There
audio.
are still.
For those of you who are not familiar with this committee, Representative Dreyer is typically much more articulate than this.
I mean, 76 alone.
And again, I don't have great expertise in these kind of things. I have experience though in web access. Sometimes you turn your video off, the audio stream sometimes doesn't buffer, but just consider that.
Can you all hear me now? Is this okay?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. I usually have very stable internet in my office. We're talking about 15,000 people.
Yeah. And Representative Dreyer, we can.
Since 1776. Still can't hear me?
Yeah. That was.
Excellent point.
Yeah, if you want to, yeah, you're buffering Representative Dreyer. We are going to have we'll give you a chance. Do you want to call in to somebody? I think I got you on my speed dial here. Hold on.
Are you calling him?
I'll call him.
Laura's calling him.
We're going to see if Representative Dreyer's blocked my phone. Quick voicemail. What's up with that? Okay, we're going to get Representative Dreyer on here momentarily, if we can. Representative Dreyer, if you can hear us, we're going to try to call you. I know that may be that's certainly not ideal with respect to our online viewers. But so we're trying to work with Representative Dreyer to get him on. I'm going to move on. I've got a question. We're going through one series of questions on this. So I would ask folks to accommodate that for me. I've got some questions for you while we're trying to get Representative Dreyer in. And as chair, I've tried to sort of help clarify things as we go. I'm speaking as a member of the committee with some questions, but still in furtherance of framing this issue. We talked and we've raised this issue. I want to raise this to the committee that we've got this balance of property rights, property interests, and speech interests. This isn't the first time we've seen that. We have public accommodation laws that apply across our code that speaks to what are the conditions when someone has a very clear property interest, when they can and cannot assert a property interest over a basic right. There's our imaginations could run wild of circumstances where do we empower private actors to, through asserting their property interest, undermine a basic fundamental right of somebody else. And substantively, would we want there to be a place where that happened? So that's something we're gonna have to weigh, no matter how we would proceed as a state, whether we proceed with legislation or not, that interest is gonna have to be weighed. Speech versus property, right? Terms and conditions versus basic rights. And we've already sort of framed that. We talked about the threshold question of illegality versus tortious action or the assertion of a tortious act versus that which is free speech. What are those thresholds? We did raise this issue, and I think as Mr. Taylor presented earlier, obscene content is addressed by the 1996 federal law. Excessively violent, and then there's this issue of or otherwise objectionable. I think the or otherwise objectionable thing, I want members of the committee to understand this or otherwise objectionable condition is red letter code within this 1996 statute. The question is, what does otherwise objectionable mean? What should it mean? What was the intention of Congress? What does it mean in terms of binding law, and what flexibility does that give states within that to maybe more expansively recognize someone's speech right, their speech interest, more generously in our state than the minimum standard by federal law. Federal law kind of provides a minimum for the states. The states can also always, as you know, provide more expansive recognition of rights than the minimum standard. So the or otherwise objectionable is something that as we go through this process, I think everybody needs to understand and kind of on your own study, get into what does that mean, and is that I believe that's a place that the platforms and entities, companies are saying, well, we think it's otherwise objectionable for other reasons, whether it be public health, whether it be, creating conflict, unnecessarily, division. I can't speak for platforms myself, but the otherwise objectionable thing exists in this. It is not just this issue of obscene or excessively violent. Otherwise objectionable, and I'll let Mr. Taylor speak to this as we get into it. That's a thing that's part of this federal statute. And then I'm gonna direct this back to Mr. Taylor in the form of a question, but I wanted members to understand that issue. So I'm sort of helping frame that as a chair. There's also this issue, again, we talked about public accommodation. When does a internet service, publicly traded or otherwise, when does it tantamount to a public accommodation? The public accommodation issue is a very real one, right? Because you think about hotels, former Secretary of State General Colin Powell, when he left New York with his wife Alma in 1958 to Fort Benning, Georgia, he was coming down for the infantry officer basics course. Their first night in Columbus, Georgia, they spent in their car, because there was not a hotel in Columbus, Georgia in 1958 that would rent a place to them. That's not where we want to be. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 addressed that issue by looking at public accommodations and hotel settings, right? That you can't discriminate in a public accommodation setting based on race and some other characteristics. Likewise, lunch counters, we know that story. So the question we ask is, and this is not an answer, I'm don't have a conclusion to this. The question is, as you think about public accommodations, when does a communications platform or service take on the nature of a public accommodation? Should they be able to discriminate based on race? Hey, we don't let people with this skin color on our platform. Is that okay? My sense is there'd be people here that would say that's not okay. I certainly would find that objectionable. Is it okay to say, oh, well, we have a platform, we're a public platform, but our terms and conditions say if you are a member of this religious faith, you can't share your otherwise sincerely held religious belief on our platform because we don't like people like you. I think folks in this room would largely find that objectionable. So we would find it objectionable in spite of the property interest they would assert. Someone could assert a property interest and say, we don't want people of this religious background to be able to speak on our site because we don't like them. Or we don't like people with this skin color on our site because we have a real prejudice against them, whatever that skin color may be. That's the question we're facing here, is there is a property interest, but to what degree is an internet service or communication service take on the nature of a public accommodation? That's the legal substance of what we're wrestling with, okay? And then lastly, I'm going to take that as context and then address this issue to Mr. Taylor to speak to specifically this issue of publisher versus public forum. Because the Section 230 addresses this issue for us as we wrestle with this of when is the service platform, whatever it is, the company, when are they accountable for what's said legally? Can they be brought into a lawsuit because of what someone said? And when can they not? If you're a newspaper, you're a publisher, you're accountable for what's being said. You curate and present the information, whether it's through an online website or whether it's through newsprint, and it's distributed to in your mailbox or in your driveway. You're a publisher there. One of the things that many of these communication services platforms are asserting and have asserted, perhaps rightly, is they're not a publisher. They're simply a forum. There may be another word that's used. Is it a forum? Are they simply just providing a town square? They're making sure no one breaks the law in the town square, but they don't stand behind or endorse any of the communications that are said. It's the people that are the speakers. This is a free speech space. We just furnish this forum. The speakers are others. It's not us. If something's posted on Facebook, the Facebook company doesn't stand behind what Representative Davis put on Facebook. She may be a UGA football fan, and she may say something that makes an Auburn football fan like Representative Wilkerson really mad, right? So they don't stand behind that, right? It's just something it's just a forum. This issue of publisher versus forum, I don't know if I have those terms right. I'm going to direct my question to Mr. Taylor. How does the publisher versus forum issue play out in the context of 230 and the 1996 bill at the federal level, and how might that be thought about by state policymakers?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I take down 3 questions within that, so I'll hit each one of them. I'll take the last one first. The Communications Decency Act explicitly applies to platforms and not publishers. If you are a publisher, what you are doing is you are providing your own point of view. You're there to advocate. Whereas the concern in the Communications Decency Act was that if you were a platform and that was hosting user material, that therefore people with prurient interests, people with nefarious, violent interests could overrun your platform. And therefore, because that is the nature of a platform where users are posting, that therefore you can do so. And you bring up an excellent point, because what's happening, so for example, when you have some of the large tech companies and the social media platforms that are censoring or outright blocking material such as opinions regarding coronavirus, opinions regarding the best treatment of coronavirus, opinions regarding other scientific, economic topics, and putting either flags on the material and saying this is misleading, or outright blocking the distribution or sharing of it. I find it curious that platforms that do this, they claim to be platforms, but clearly they're becoming publishers. Clearly they're taking that on deliberately and intentionally. And then yet they're looking for protection as a platform. And you make a good point. One of the questions and concerns that I've heard expressed, and I agree with, is what's to prevent from the Heartland Institute. Shouldn't the Heartland Institute be able to publish what the Heartland Institute wants without it being overrun by users, by commentators? And because we're not functioning for the primary purpose of being a user-oriented entity, therefore it wouldn't apply. As you can see in my points, good legislation would apply specifically to entities whose primary purpose is to allow users to share their points of view. And once you start opinionating or giving opinions on your own as that entity, you're getting further and further away from the pure platform for which these protections apply. To your second question and comment regarding property rights and free speech, that's an excellent point, and I'm glad this has come up so much. I'm glad that legislators here in Georgia are so on fire for free markets and for property rights. That makes me happy. But when it's applied in this context, keep in mind Ron Paul. So Ron Paul is about as libertarian as it gets. So if we're talking about libertarian free market principles, Ron Paul has come out very strongly and said, look, a free market does not exist in this space. The corporate entities that have arisen with the assistance and protection of government. Section 230 itself is an abrogation of free markets. It's providing protections that otherwise would not exist under common law. Ron Paul has very forcefully said we need to do something about this as a free market, as a freedom-oriented guy. Clarence Thomas, in a recent Supreme Court opinion in which he noted that the court should give very careful consideration to whether, as you mentioned, the internet does fit what would be considered a public carrier under law that has existed for many decades. This is very similar. Clarence Thomas has speculated to, for example, whether it's the telephone companies 50, 60 years ago, or whatever public carriers have existed in the past. And there is precedent, and wise precedent, that says you must comply with certain standards if you're going to be in that sphere. And then the other point that you brought up, the publisher, otherwise objectionable. And that really is the key on the legal argument. So the argument has been made that states shouldn't even become involved in this because clearly they are preempted by federal law. It's a futile exercise. Nothing good can come of it because federal law clearly protects the internet companies for whatever censorship they desire. That argument, it hinges on an interpretation of or otherwise objectionable, those three words. Everything in the Communications Decency Act, language, spirit of the law, is clearly applying to decency standards. It's applying to material that is sexually obscene or excessively violent. It's spelled out in the title of the Communications Decency Act. It's spelled out in the title of the sections, of the individual sections of the act, and it's explicitly described in the subsection for which the protection against censorship occurs. Each and every example is an example of excessively violent or sexually obscene material. And I think that's important to understand. Now, as far as a committee in Georgia or any other state that's considering legislation, my point is that legislators are well within their rights to protect free speech online and are not preempted by the Federal Communications Decency Act. And if somebody wants to make an argument that federal law preempts state law, well, then they can certainly take that to the courts and let the courts decide. But I think the Supreme Court, looking at the law in its language and intent, I think will side with state legislators.
Thank you. I'm going to go again one round. So I've recognized you before. I'm not going to recognize you again in this round. Mike 6, is that represent? Who's Mike 6? Okay. Okay. So can I come back to you in our final round here?
Yeah, actually, I was going to just point out that Representative Dreyer is back online and would like to speak. But I would like to ask, but I'll let him go first.
Okay, we'll recognize him. Chair recognizes Representative Dreyer remotely. Representative Dreyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for bearing with me, committee members as well. One point I was trying to get across earlier is we heard a lot about Boston, 15,000 people in a town square, but that was not the most impactful way to communicate at the time. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published and distributed 500,000 copies in the year 1776 alone. I mean, that is what impacted. Most historians look at that as the turning point that led to the revolution for American independence. It wasn't people debating on Boston's town hall to such a great degree. It was as much people talking in bars and taverns and offices as much as it was the town square, but it was ultimately the printing press. So yeah, what we are talking about in this, if that's the analogy, is that we're seizing the printing press so that everyone, no matter how unpopular their opinion, should be able to express themselves. And if there is a monopoly on printing presses, there is a way to deal with that, and that is federal antitrust law. That is a well-defined body of law that is useful and instructive, and that in my opinion is not the purview of the Georgia State Legislature. because it is a national issue with national law already addressing it. The final thing on the analogy of the private prisons, I think that is an extremely flawed analogy as well, because I've sued private prisons, and I will guarantee you every single time I do, they're asserting sovereign immunity under the shield of the federal government, because the federal government is the only entity that, other than state legislatures and the powers that flow through them, that have sovereign immunity. Obviously, it's not private prisons. It's not private entity. They are exercising government regulation. So look, I mean, this system may not be perfect, but I would like us to have a more precise conversation, because I think some of these metaphors are hyperbolic, and they are making it difficult to have a robust conversation on this.
Okay. Representative Dreyer, anything else?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
You got it. Anybody else online that's wanting to be recognized? Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Mr. Taylor finish up any last remarks briefly, and then we're going to open up sort of a discussion for members of the committee about the issues that are being sort of teed up. Again, there's not a bill as such. I don't want the whole hearing to be just addressing Mr. Taylor only and Mr. Schulte, but Mr. Taylor, any wrap-up remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin just by taking a few moments to address Representative Dreyer's concerns, and thank you for presenting them. It's good that we share our concerns on all sides of the issue. I would urge not to underestimate the impact of the town square in 1776, but to the extent that pamphlets were also distributed in bars or restaurants or whatever it may be. Again, in the 21st century, this is how Americans and Georgians distribute their pamphlets and their ideas. It's on the internet, it's on social media. And we have these entities that are seeking to restrict that and taking away their ability. I think it's doing a disservice to Georgians to say, well, if you don't have the ability on Facebook and Twitter to share your political ideas, you're not very much infringed at all. You can go down to your local bar and tell people it's not the way it was then when you had 15,000 people that are meeting together then. This is a severe and serious infringement on our political free speech, on our cultural free speech, on our religious free speech. And I think that we should always err on the side of protecting that speech. The analogy regarding prisons, again, I'm not sure if I understood your point about sovereign immunity, but I can tell you this. Again, none of us would think it's okay for private actors, private companies who are running the prisons to infringe upon our unalienable rights simply because, well, these statutes only apply to government. Now, certainly you can say government is contracting out, but it's the principle. It's not the technicalities. It's the principle that these are rights that Americans should not have taken away by public or private entities. And I think that Georgians and Americans, the reason why you're hearing with such a loud voice concern about this, the reason why in 33 states you are seeing legislation being advanced, the reason why there will be bills passed and turned into law is because people very, very strongly are going to protect their right to engage in free speech. And I think it's good that Georgia is looking into this because Georgia can do it right. There are ways that there are bills that can pass that would overly infringe upon our property rights, that would overly infringe upon our other rights, that would suppress speech, that could be passed for nefarious purpose rather than for the principle of protecting free speech, not for partisan reasons, not for political payback. If it's done right, this is something that will be a benefit to all Georgians. Okay. And just when you ask for final comments, and just to tie that together, I just encourage legislators in Georgia and throughout the country to understand that free speech is an unalienable right by anybody, and craft a bill that's careful. Craft a bill that respects our other interests, craft a bill that's not going to be a political payback or anything, but craft a bill that protects free speech, because online is where Americans rely on for sharing their ideas. We rely on it. So thank you for considering this today. Thank you for having me here today, and I'm happy to answer other questions as well.
Okay. Well, we're going to wrap up your presentation. Is there anybody today I'm going to go around the room with members. Is there anybody today that's here present with us that wants to speak to this issue while we have our committee time? I can't give you much time, but is there any entities today that want to do that? I'm gonna go around. We'll take legislators here. We're going to wrap up with legislators. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to go around the room. I'm going to recognize. Yes. Hey, Representative Oliver. Chair recognizes Representative Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the risk of being a little, sounding a little impatient, forgive me, but I'm like everybody, I'm super busy today doing other things. We are here, in my personal opinion, because Facebook and Twitter have limited President Trump. This is a political discussion, a partisan discussion brought by the Heartland. And I'm glad that the chair has suggested that the other states that are doing their legislation is not a super strong mandate for us right now. I'll be very brief. I guess I'm just a little unhappy about a platform about free speech that really is about, in my view today, the modern corporate world, and they're asserting their own responsibilities in the private market. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Appreciate ladies' opinion. I would differ. The lady and I have vigorous discussions and sometimes differ. I would say this is way bigger than 2020. I think it's an issue that sometimes the attention on issues force legislators to address things that should have been addressed much sooner. I would tell the lady that this committee perhaps should have been having this conversation in 2014, 2015. And to the extent we weren't, then I would ask the state to, say we should do better. But I would say, and I would say earnestly, we worked together on things before. I would ask the Representative Oliver and other members of the committee, let's work on this issue and let's ensure that it's something that's bigger than any one American or claims. Or that's why I don't want to get. I mean, I don't want to allow this very important question to be swallowed by prominent issues that are not unimportant, but they're not central to they're not a 10 or 20 or 30-year solution. I think this is a multi-decade issue for us. So I would disagree with the lady's characterization, but I appreciate the it's your opinion. Let's direct this in a way that's productive. That's looking forward, not looking backward.
Chairman Martin.
I got Chairman Martin for a question.
Thank you, Chairman Salsa. You guys didn't need to have to look at me all day with not being dressed like the chair. I want to thank you, and I'll be brief as well. I believe the issue we have is not. Well, let me first go back and start this. I think we have to be very careful about when we inject government opinion into the private business. I think some points have been brought up today that there's things you can do out on the street, but I don't have to let you do it in my home. I think the issue we have with some of these tech companies and social media platforms, that we have to walk a very fine line as and if government decides it wants to get involved. Because the only thing I know that can make a situation worse sometimes is government involvement in it. It is that people feel like they created the platform. I mean, Facebook was not created by Mr. Zuckerberg. It was created, an application was created, and then the people created Facebook because everybody joined, and they joined under this circumstance, and the dialogue was open. Now I feel like there's subjectivity being put forth on some of the speech that's been made. So if Facebook, for instance, decided it was taking no political speech, as they stopped before the election, I believe they shut down their ads, all political ads, not state political ads, and they took national political ads. They shut them all down. I think that's one thing. I think what bothers people, what I hear from people, is the subjective opinions applied by either an algorithm or an individual that is applied countywide and from countywide to countrywide. So I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. This is something that one has to look at and be very careful that there's not an overstep, and be very careful that we don't express our subjectivity over the top of another set of subjectivity, because by doing that, we're not making it any better, and we could actually be making it worse. But I also understand that what the gentleman said from Heartland, that if there's going to be the speech allowed, it should not be censored from one group or the other. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to go around the room, recognize folks. If you're online and you want to speak to this issue, whether it's a question or a remark and a perspective for the committee, go ahead and raise your hand if you would through the application. There's a hand raise function. Go ahead and do that now. I'm going to go around the room. I'm going to recognize, I've got 3 members that want to be recognized as sort of closing remarks to the committee. Again, this is kind of a committee discussion. And then I'll recognize folks online before we wrap up. So with that, Chair recognizes Representative Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Taylor, I was a little confused.
And again, what I'd like to, Mr. Taylor's presentation's over. I'd really like to focus on this issue for the committee. So if you could address the committee, this is not a, if you could, I would just ask, that's the direction I'd like to take the last.
Oh,
20
okay. Well,
minutes.
I'm sorry. I thought at the beginning of his speech, he was saying that he's not against the Communication Decency Act, the Section 230. And I was just going to verify that that is what was said at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then point out the fact that he also pointed out he was hoping that Georgia would draft a better law or better legislation. And I went back and I thought about the legislation that we are doing here in Georgia. We did Senate Bill 359, which basically limits the liability people can put on businesses during COVID. So when we talk about opening up liability for the private businesses such as Facebook and all that, I don't know that Georgia would be better at crafting legislation in that area, as well as with Senate Bill 77, where we protect historical monuments. Now, some would say that we weren't protecting historical monuments, we were protecting Confederate monuments as opposed to your overall historical. So when I went back and looked at even the issue of infringement of rights, Senate Bill 202, for me, would be an infringement of my voting rights, whereas someone else would see it as election integrity. I'm just doing a quick overview of Georgia as a whole when it comes to laws, liberty, and it's clear that we're on different spectrums, but trying to get to the same end. But I can get with you later to see if I did hear you correctly or not, because I was a little confused about that Section 202.
Representative Davis, thank you.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative McLeod. Again, we're in the posture. I'm not going to ask Mr. Taylor and Schulte to sit in another part of the room. They're having presented, but again, Representative McLeod for a discussion point of the committee.
Thank you. Is it on? So I wanted to really kind of address the 1964 Voting Rights Act, and just to get a clarification of government responsibility versus business. So our government collects taxes from taxpayers, mostly through income and sales tax. So we have a responsibility when we take the oath to serve and to protect our constituents. I think the 1964 Act was just doing just that. These Black human beings were not being treated as equal citizens. And so I do not want it to be compared to this kind of proposal, because human rights is a different kind of rights, okay? So let's make that clear. I'm very upset about even bringing that up. And as far as Rand Paul, he said if he was if he had the ability to vote on the Civil Rights Act of 64, he'd probably have voted against it. So I just want to make sure that we are clear about libertarianism. Government and its responsibility to its citizen is the primary reason why we're here. And my and everyone in this room's first responsibility is to our citizen and to protect them, period. End of story, nothing in between. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair recognizes again for a remark to the committee, Representative Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will address the committee with really just two observations. I would like to join Representative McLeod in expressing my just my disgust at the analogy between what we're talking about here and the Civil Rights Act. I do not see these two things as similar or even close to equal. You know, the term public accommodation in the law is defined. It sounds like a layman's term, but it's actually very specific in that the Civil Rights Act was designed to, is applied to places of public accommodation, including hotels, restaurants, theaters, and physical establishments of that nature. And the purpose of that was because under the Commerce Clause, the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. And all of these accommodations relate to interstate travel, which all reflect on what I will call our freedom of movement. So to me, there is no compelling reason why anybody would need to use social media, for example, in order to live and to thrive in this country. So to me, these are not analogous.
To the lady's question, do you dispute that a email service or internet platform is interstate commerce?
I think it could have some aspects of it, but it's not the same as interstate travel as, as defined under the law in the year 1964.
Do you believe, and I don't want to pick on any one platform, but just a platform I use a lot and have high regard for, we'll say YouTube, for example. Would you recognize that the ubiquity of YouTube across our country is an interstate commercial activity?
It is, but we're talking about a free market. YouTube is not the only platform out there that exists for people who choose to engage in that form of entertainment.
We're getting there. I appreciate it. So I don't think it's indisputable that YouTube is an interstate commercial activity. So to say that YouTube doesn't fall into the purview of the Commerce Clause, it's just, we would both recognize that it does. It is an interstate commercial activity.
YouTube did not exist when the Civil Rights Act was passed.
I agree. And because of that, it was not enumerated in the hotels, restaurants, theaters list because it didn't exist. The question would be, as an interstate commercial activity, would it have been addressed in the 64 Civil Rights Act? I would suggest to you, if, again, this is hypothetical, but if in 1964 there were interstate commercial platforms that said, because of your skin color, you can't post on YouTube, I would tell you that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would have absolutely included that. That if it said, we're not going to allow someone with this skin color to post on our platform, which is an interstate commercial platform, I would tell you that list of hotels, restaurants, and theaters would have included internet platforms in 1964 had they existed, if the practice had been that you can't post because of the color of your skin. That's the question here. It's one of indisputable commercial activity, and in this case, it's a Commerce Clause issue. But even without respect to the Commerce Clause, it's clearly a circumstance that's used across the state. It gives rise to this issue of public accommodations, this issue of equal access, whether it's based on skin color, whether it's based on national origin, whether it's based on perhaps religious expression. Speech has broad protections, and as such, it gives rise to this question of, does a internet platform, if it's the means by which people communicate, and I'll let members of the public ask themselves the question, is a public platform an open platform that is if not a primary means of communications? And if it is, should people be able to be throttled based on their religious beliefs, skin color, national origin, or handicap dependence. I mean, you look at some of these. So you just ask this question. I think most folks, I think our constituents would say that ain't fair. That's the question here. So I want to frame the questions first. I mean, I think we do well to define, is there a problem? What's the nature of the problem? And if there is a problem, is it something that the legislature should address? Maybe we shouldn't. But I would suggest to you, and I'll give the lady the platform back. I would suggest that if we're going to address the Commerce Clause, a YouTube is clearly a multi-state commercial activity. And if there were pernicious, or as the term would be described, invidious discrimination being used, and I'm not suggesting that it is, but if it were, then that would be a problem. And we recognize, I think, the question is, what should the standard be for these platforms or these services making decisions about, based on this content, what you said here, you can speak or you can't speak, or based on your perspective, whether it's a religious perspective. I've not seen any platforms that have made those decisions based on people's skin color, and I hope I never do. Hope we never see that. But I don't think it's a stretch of an analogy, and I think it's one that, as we think about these publicly accessible services that are important to basic rights, it is our job to think about these things. I mean, I would take issue with the lady to suggest that it's a radically different circumstance, because it is almost the same, I would suggest, in terms of these broadly used interstate commercial activities that become important public services. That's why we're talking about it. But
Yep.
Lady has the floor.
Chairman, I appreciate the spirited discussion, but if internet platforms are in fact actors within the interstate commerce arena, then regulating interstate commerce under the Commerce Clause is an exclusively federal obligation. So I don't know why we're talking about this at the state level.
I would say it gives the federal government the power to speak to it. The Commerce Clause doesn't give Congress the exclusive power to regulate activities that have some interstate interest. It gives them the power to do it at all. If there weren't an interstate interest, they would have zero power to do it. The Commerce Clause gives them the power to engage in it some, but it does not preclude states any more than it precludes us from having regulations that affect Home Depot or Coke. These are multi-state national interests. We address them within the sphere of our role as state legislators all the time. That's why they're walking the Capitol all the time and talking to us. So it's not exclusively the province of the federal government to address things. I would remind you. I know you know that.
Yeah. So I just have one additional comment, is that I know that today's discussion has focused pretty much exclusively on big tech, the cartel, right? The household names, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, what have you. But, having reviewed some of the legislation that the Heartland Institute has advocated for, has lobbied for in other states, the idea is that, there are some people out there who want to create a private right of action to sue a company like Facebook, some kind of internet service, for what they perceive as censorship, for a denial of their First Amendment right, setting aside the fact that it's only the government that can deny your First Amendment rights. This private right of action in some cases would allow, someone like me to sue a private company for upwards of $75,000 for what I might describe as censorship. Now, Facebook might be able to afford big shot lawyers to go to court every time they're summoned, or even to pay the fee. But these provisions would equally apply to small tech companies. And so I fear that, this is going to silence the voices of not just the big monopolistic style companies, but also smaller tech companies that are trying to rise to the top to compete against these big companies. So that's my concern too. It has to come down to kind of what Representative Davis was talking about. It's like, it's a double-edged sword. You might want to protect, these people who I will describe as offering, bad speech, that, limits what people are able to do and how they're able to come together as a community without that cancerous type of conversation infecting everybody else that's trying to simply use these platforms to build a community and speak with each other. I mean, these companies, whether we're talking about a big tech company or a small tech company, these are private businesses, and these are not places of public accommodation. And, I trust the free market that if there is, if YouTube decides tomorrow that they're going to exclude a particular racial group, that's going to be the downfall of that particular platform. And there will be competition that rises to the top to become the new predominant platform. So I feel like I am closer to the libertarian stance on this than some other people in this room. But I will just conclude with that. Thank you for your time, Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Moore. Chair recognizes Representative Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're talking kind of in a vacuum about what these platforms preclude. And I don't see I'm looking at Facebook's community standards and what they allow for. So we all agree that violence and criminal behavior is not something that should be acceptable on these safety issues, violent and graphic content, adult nudity, sexual activity, sexual solicitation. All of those things, I think everybody in this room can agree are okay for them to set this policy. But the one we're not thinking about is when you are back in the Boston Square, or you said something on TV, or you published something in the paper, whatever it was, if it is false and it is defamatory, there's a cause of action. And the only thing that is defensible is the truth. These platforms, you don't even have to provide your real name. You don't have to provide any sort of contact information or identifying information on these platforms. Yet people have no filter on these platforms and can say some very untrue, hateful things. There's no way for the public to hold those people accountable. First of all, it would be extremely expensive with the amount of untruths I've seen on these platforms to go and file a defamation claim against offenders. But it puts Facebook in a position where I believe they should be able to determine whether or not, if it's easily identifiable, whether it's authentic and true. And so if you can't hold the offender on those sites liable for under the law, then I think the companies, the private companies that are allowing all of this content out for, we've expanded the ability to hit masses of people through these platforms, but yet you can't hold the offenders accountable on these platforms. And so that's another reason I think these private companies should be able to set their policies so that everyone who gets on it knows exactly what they are looking for and what they are verifying, and there's no question. And so I think we're going too far with what is suggested as possible.
What's question? What has anything been? I don't want to be testy with you. Have we suggested anything other than there's an issue?
No, but I'm bringing up that additional point about holding people who say things that are untrue and ruin businesses on these platforms that y'all would qualify at, not y'all, that people might say would be censorship. I think these companies have a right, if they're going to have these platforms out here and people don't have to identify themselves. With email, I know who I'm emailing most of the time. I have been given their email address and they've given me permission to email them, and it's private. That's different than what is on these sites. Somebody could say, Shay Roberts' hair is blue, and my law firm might not want to hire a blue-haired lawyer, and that could damage my reputation, and I wouldn't know who damaged my reputation. That's a totally silly example, but you understand what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Chair recognizes Representative Wilkerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I just have a question. We brought up the Civil Rights Act in 1964 a few times, which my understanding was dealing with like race, religion, sex, etc. I guess it's a question for the committee. Does that protect free speech? or the expression of ideas, or is it more about who you are inherently? Because if we're going to keep bringing up this, I'm trying to connect how
Yeah.
this deals with Civil Rights Act.
Again, it came up in the discussion. You're weighing a property interest versus a liberty interest. Should you have is there a constitutional right to, and I'm saying this, by the way, I'm just saying this in the context of a question. I don't know that there is a constitutional right to, as such, to eat at a restaurant, but there's a liberty interest there. To deny someone the ability to eat in a restaurant or go to a hotel is an attack on their basic liberty interests. So that was being weighed in that. There's a liberty interest here that you can look at and say there's a very clearly definable property interest, but the arguers, the people that came and successfully made the 64 Civil Rights Act happen, said there's a liberty interest here that is being attacked, and it's unacceptable. Okay. The question here is it's a whether you call it a liberty interest, whether you call it a speech interest, it's competing interests. I mean, this speech is a fundamental basic right. Property is a fundamental basic right. These two things are in conflict with each other. How do we reconcile that? That's what legislatures do, and things that are basic rights, as Representative Roberts and others have said very clearly, there's a property interest here, but there's also a liberty interest here, and those things conflict with each other. They're not, it's not self-regulating. You can't just say, well, I have a right to free speech. Well, I have a right to property. Well, both of those are true. What legislatures are called to do, the reason there's a General Assembly, the reason there's a Congress is because you have to reconcile and fit these things together in a workable way so the property interest can be recognized, so the speech interest can be recognized, so these things fit as well as they can. They don't enforce themselves. That's what we're wrestling with here. That's what the Civil Rights Act wrestled with. Because you could say the Civil Rights Act fell short. It should have been more than just, as Representative Moore so astutely laid out, restaurants, hotels, theaters. There may be another category, but it's an enumerated list. There are other places that probably should have been done. But they were trying to fit these things together in a way that addressed the big issues as best they could. This is just 60 years later, a way to think about things. You've got property interests, which are legitimate. I think we can all agree with platform, and a liberty interest, speech. How do we fit these together in an appropriate way? I mean, if there's not an issue, there's no problem.
But we're talking about private interest. So I'm thinking,
Yeah.
If you have a company and I come to that company, you say, I don't want to hire you because you're Black, you're an African-American, that I believe would be a violation of law. If you say, I don't really want any Democrats around here, is that a violation of law? I mean, so that's what that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about two different things. We're talking about trying to force a private company to let you put something on that's objectionable. So it's not just sex, it's not just violence, but that last part is objectionable. And who defines objectionable?
Right. So thank you. That's the question we're facing.
Yeah.
Is who should define that? Is a private entity. When does a private entity's importance rise to the level of something that the public would want to get involved in? Because prior to 1964, the discussion was, well, you're a private entity, you have your private property rights, you can let anyone eat from your lunch counter that you want to or nobody. It's completely your decision. And that was the argument before 1964. Yeah. But there's a recognition, there's this liberty interest that is in our hearts. We look at this and say, this liberty interest, these people is wrong. Alma Powell and Colin Powell shouldn't have to sleep in their car in 1958 because there's no Civil Rights Act yet. There's a liberty interest they have that's attacked by that. Yeah. So we're trying to wrestle with these things. It's the same question in Georgia. It's a right to work state. If I work for you and you said, well, Setzler, I don't like this thing you said on the internet. I'm going to fire you for what you said on Facebook. It's my own time. It's my own speech. I wasn't representing myself as an agent of your company. It was done after hours. It's on my personal Facebook page. And you say, yeah, but Ed, look at what you said, man. You said this publicly. My customers see what you said. It's affecting my business. My customers don't want to do business with me anymore because you're my employee and you're saying these awful things. You're fired for that. Well, I mean, that's a private property interest versus a speech interest. Those things are in conflict with each other. And it takes laws to flesh out, it takes case law in some cases in the courts to flesh out, when does Mr. Wilkerson, the business owner, get to fire Ed Setzler, his employee, because I'm saying stupid things in my private time, but it affects his business. It's a right to work state. but it's free speech. How do you work? That's what we're trying to reconcile. These things have to be worked out by legislatures if there's an issue. And we're trying to understand the contours of this so we don't just go out there with a broadsword and swing it and say the problem's solved. And we've created new problems, as Chairman Martin said. I mean, we're trying to understand the issue. And that's why I'm asking you guys as committee members, bring folks in that want to speak to this. We're trying to understand this first. There may be no issue we need to address, or there may be, but it may be as complex as Mr. Wilkerson firing Setzler because he said stupid things in his private time. There's an issue there, right? You would agree there's certain things that a private employee of yours, if they said in their own time that were so bad, they rise to the level of which it affects your business. You got to be able to fire them. I mean, I think you would agree with that, right? So how do we reconcile that? Yeah. So, but at the same time, you wouldn't want someone to fire you because you're involved in political speech. You're active politically. Well, I mean, we're wrestling with these balances here. That's how do we reconcile these things? That's what we're here. And this is not a simple issue. That's why I would encourage some members, don't just drop a bill. Don't drop a bill that's doing what Alaska or Hawaii is doing. Let's think about this.
Yeah. And I think it just comes around to 64. I think several members have touched on that because in that Colin Powell example, there was no recourse for that family. There was no alternative for that family that's traveling. Yeah. So if I'm on the internet and if Facebook doesn't want me, maybe I go to Twitter, maybe I go to Instagram, because as an elected official, I mean, I've trying to figure out which one I want to post to this time, but I do have alternatives. But if I'm driving with my family down a dark road and I have to stop for a hotel and that hotel stops me, as a legislative body, as elected officials, we decide, do we have to get involved? In this case, I don't know what the sense of urgency is to protect somebody's ability to go on and say, I think Ed Setzler is a great representative. I mean, they should be able to say that, but I don't know if, at what point do we stop and say we need to get involved in the legislative body? And I appreciate you having this hearing and let us ask those questions.
Online, Representative Gilligan, question. Representative Gilligan?
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay, good. Don't want to have another repeat with poor Representative Dreyer when I'm buffering and you can't understand any words that I say. I want to thank you, Chairman, for having this meeting. I think it's been great to hear discussions. I think that going forward, we need to have more meetings like this. I want to thank the presenters who came in and presented information. There's information that obviously some of us will agree with and some of us will go, let me scratch my head a little bit. And I think that's the kind of engagement that is good for all of us in this committee and in this body to have. So I want to just thank you so much for this opportunity. I do want to make a couple of comments. We all represent roughly 50,000 people in our respective districts. And each of those individuals must have their rights protected. And we all take the same exact oath to protect the Constitution, not only of the United States, but of the state of Georgia. And I think that by the engagement in this discussion here, we know that every one of us is taking those oaths very seriously. I do have a couple of examples that I'd like to bring up that I think merit us, again, having more discussions along this line. One was an entrepreneur who during the I guess it was the interim between the November and the January runoff elections, he had posted on his social media a video. It was a local government video, but he was immediately and permanently banned from Facebook. Now, this entrepreneur had 3 businesses that he used the Facebook marketplace in order to further his business. He had spent his own company money on advertisement, and suddenly, because he was blocked, all of his entities were also blocked. He had nowhere to go. So that is a concern. And I'm sure if it happened to this one gentleman, it happened to somebody in each and every one of our districts. And another one is a little bit more personal because it's a family member who was targeted by a romance scam. And when I was dealing with the platform to get that scammer removed and blocked, I was the one hitting the wall. So I'm sure that I'm not the only person who has a family member or at least a constituent in our district who has been targeted by a scammer on a social media platform. So just as Representative Roberts was talking about false identities and fake reviews, when we can prove that there's a false identity or a fake review that is seeking to do harm to one of our constituents, we need to be able to hold these platforms accountable. So I may have digressed too far from what you were trying to do in our meeting, but I just want to thank you. Again, Chairman Setzler, for having this meeting and for the people who came. And I appreciate every single comment that has been made by all of my colleagues.
Thank you. Anyone else online? No more hands. We're about 15 minutes over. So I want to thank everybody for being with us today. I'd like to thank the representatives of the Heartland Institute, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Schulte, for coming in today. They were the coalition of the willing today that was willing to be here and speak. I would ask our members of the committee, bring folks to me, Diana Brooks, 402 Suite. She's my assistant. So we're going to have, we'll have one or more, there may be two more we do over the course of the summer. I want to just kind of use this as a tee up for the issue. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to again, is there an issue that needs to be addressed? If so, what is it? And then how would we do it? I'm still a believer. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm still a believer. I hold out faith that free speech is a bipartisan issue. I still believe that. I'm a pretty ardent free speech person. Some of you had been doing my speech before, but I believe that. I hold out that hope. But I do think it's something we can't not do something about. But I do want to define the issue. And is there one? Is there something that's worthy of being addressed? And with that, I want to ask everybody, sort of deputize our committee members, bring things to us. If there's some speakers, some experts we can hear from. Everybody that comes here is subject to get shot at. If you stand here, the committee is going to shoot at you. They shot at you guys for an hour, and that's what I love to see. You know, no one gets to be here and gets treated with kid gloves. So with that, Representative Wade, in fact, Representative came to me earlier when we were in session about this issue. So I asked him to be part of our committee. I'll recognize you briefly. Yes, sir. What's your number? I don't know what the number is. Could you push the button there? Could you step down to where Representative McLeod was? I'm pretty loud. But there's people online. Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, Representative Wade asked if he could sit in on our hearing today. So as a member, I'm going to recognize him. Yeah, Representative Wade. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'm not a member, but I appreciate all the comments heard today. I wanted to share this perspective as I listened and watched and took some local issues where I had people, look, I'm a freshman and I laugh. I think people think because they couldn't get an answer from a county commissioner or a school board member, they just call me as the next line when they have an issue. But during the pandemic in my community, and once elected, I had
and Representative Wade, we're in penalty time, so go.
Very well-meaning folks concerned because they were holding their church services virtually through platforms, and their church was blocked, and they didn't know what to do. And this is just a basic church service. And then I also had a situation of a constituent that shared a story, and it actually reminded me a lot of Ms. Davis's story. And they did a video post talking about their family's history, and they were blocked. And I sat there and imagined what would happen and what would her recourse if her story that she shared with us was videoed and it was shared on a platform. And then a platform just decided to block what she told this entire committee today. What would her recourse be? Because I didn't find anything that she said to violate what those terms of those agreements are. And so the individual does have a right to speak. And if they're an open platform, and has anybody ever paid to be on Facebook or Twitter or any of these things? I mean, but you're open, but if she was blocked, what is her recourse? What can she do? So that's why I'm glad to be a part of the committee, is because for me, it is about protecting her right to speak. And if it's not violating the terms of those service and it is a public square, this is an issue. I don't know what we need to do about it, but I'm telling you, I have constituents that are concerned and they just want a level playing field for everybody. And I appreciate the conversation and being able to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Wade. Appreciate you being here. And I would encourage, if there's other members in our body that want to participate in this conversation, they're welcome to join us for any future meetings we do. And with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you.